I read the letter 3 times before I set it down on the kitchen table. Then I poured myself a glass of bourbon, walked to the window, and looked out at the oak tree I planted the year my son was born. My name is Walter Chambers. I am 68 years old. And this is the story of how a single Thanksgiving dinner changed everything I thought I knew about my family, and what I decided to do about it. My son's name is Ethan. He is 39 years old, works in finance in Atlanta, and married a woman named Claire 7 years ago. Claire is sharp, well-dressed, and has a way of smiling at you that never quite reaches her eyes. I noticed it at the wedding. I told myself I was being an old fool. For the first 4 years of their marriage, I drove the 6 hours from Knoxville to Atlanta 3 or 4 times a year. I brought things. Groceries when they were tight on money early in Ethan's career. A check for $8,000 when the transmission on Claire's car blew out. Another check $12,000 when they needed to cover the down payment gap on their house in Dunwoody. I never asked for anything back. I never mentioned the money again after I handed it over. That is not how I was raised. And it is not how I raised my son. My wife, Ethan's mother, passed 8 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 14 weeks from diagnosis to the end. Her name was Ruth, and she was the kind of woman who remembered every birthday, who kept a handwritten recipe box, and who cried at commercials for paper towels because, she said, they always showed families being kind to each other. After she died, Ethan was the only family I had left. His sister, my daughter Patricia, lives in Portland, and we talk every Sunday. But she has her own life, her own children, her own world. Ethan was the one who was supposed to be close. I say supposed to be. The first Thanksgiving after Ruth died, I drove to Atlanta. Claire had decorated the house beautifully. There were candles and a centerpiece, and the good china I had never seen them use before. I thought, this is going to be all right. I sat at the table where my son carved a turkey, and his wife poured wine, and I told myself that Ruth would have been happy to see this, that her boy had built something real. The years after that were fine. Not warm, exactly, but fine. I helped where I was needed. When their son Noah was born, my grandson, the most perfect thing I had seen since the morning Ethan himself was born, I drove to Atlanta and stayed 2 weeks. I did the grocery runs. I fixed the leaking pipe under the kitchen sink that Ethan had been ignoring. I sat in the rocking chair Ruth had picked out for our own nursery 40 years ago, the one I had driven down in my truck as a gift, and I held Noah while his parents slept. Noah called me Pop. He is 4 years old now, and the last time I saw him was 7 months before that Thanksgiving. I should have noticed the distance growing. Maybe I did notice and told myself it was nothing. The calls got shorter. Ethan started texting instead of calling. Claire's texts were always polite and always somehow final, like a door being closed quietly so you wouldn't hear the click. Invitations to visit started coming with conditions: not a good weekend. We have a lot going on, maybe next month. Next month kept moving. I stopped by a hardware store in Knoxville that October and found myself standing in the greeting card aisle. I picked up a card for Noah's upcoming birthday, one with a cartoon dog on the front because he loves dogs. I stood there for a long time and realized I was not sure what toys he was into anymore. I was not sure what he ate for breakfast. I had a grandson 4 years old and I was becoming a stranger to him. I drove home and I called Ethan and I said I wanted to come for Thanksgiving. There was a pause. The kind of pause that is its own answer. He said he would check with Claire. He called back 2 days later and said, "Yes, of course, come down. They would love to have me." I should have heard what was underneath those words. I was too busy being relieved. I arrived the Wednesday before Thanksgiving with a carload of things. 2 pies I had baked myself from recipes in Ruth's handwritten box. A bag of Noah's favorite crackers that I had remembered. Finally, after a phone call to Patricia, who had seen the boy more recently than I had, a bottle of good Tennessee whiskey for Ethan, a scented candle set for Claire because Patricia told me women like those things, and I had no better idea. The house looked the same. Claire opened the door and hugged me the way you hug someone at a work function. Ethan came out from the kitchen and shook my hand, and then pulled me into a hug that lasted about 1 second longer than Claire's. Noah came running down the hall in his socks and crashed into my legs and said, "Pop, pop, pop," and I reached down and picked him up, and for a moment everything felt exactly right. That moment lasted through dinner on Wednesday night. Thursday was different. Claire's parents arrived Thursday morning. Her father, a retired orthodontist from Savannah named Gerald, has a way of filling every room he enters. Her mother, Diane, floats behind him like a very well-dressed shadow. They are not bad people, but they arrived and the house rearranged itself around them. The good chairs, the center of every conversation, the punchlines of every story. Gerald told a long anecdote about a fishing trip and everyone laughed. I sat at the end of the table and smiled and refilled my own water glass. Thanksgiving dinner itself was fine. The food was good. Claire had made everything except the pies, and when Gerald praised the turkey, she glowed in a way I had not seen directed at me in years. Ethan sat between us both and laughed at the right moments and refilled wine glasses I realized watching him, performing. He was performing the role of good husband and good son-in-law. He was very good at it. I was not sure where the role of good son had gone. After dinner, Gerald and Diane settled in the living room and I helped clear the table. I was rinsing dishes when I heard the conversation shift in the next room. I was not trying to listen. The kitchen is open to the dining area, and sound carries in that house. I have been in it enough times to know. Gerald was talking. His voice is the kind that carries whether he intends it or not. He was saying something about the retirement community his cousin had moved into. How nice it was. How it took pressure off the whole family. Then Claire's voice, quieter but still clear enough. We've actually been talking about something like that. For when the time comes. Gerald. Smart to plan ahead. Claire. Walter's in good health now, but he's not getting younger. And honestly, Ethan and I can't. We have Noah. We have our careers. We have our lives here. It's not realistic to think we'd be able to. Ethan's voice, lower than both of theirs. Claire. A short silence. Claire again, quieter. I'm just being honest. We've talked about this. I kept rinsing the dish in my hands. The water was running over my wrist and I had stopped feeling it. I set the dish down on the drying rack very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands are not entirely steady. I went back to the table and picked up 2 more plates and brought them to the sink. I did not say anything. I finished the dishes. I dried my hands on the kitchen towel that hung from the oven handle. I went to the living room and I sat in the chair by the window, the one that was slightly apart from the group, and I listened to Gerald tell another story, and I laughed when everyone else laughed. And when Noah climbed into my lap at 7:30, I held him and stared at the top of his head, and thought about Ruth, and thought about the oak tree in my backyard, and thought about a great many things that had no business being thought about at a Thanksgiving table. I drove home Friday morning. I told them I had a commitment, which was a lie, but it was the kind of lie that lets everyone leave the room with their dignity more or less intact. Claire hugged me at the door with the same work function hug. Ethan walked me to my truck and started to say something and then didn't. Noah stood on the porch in his pajamas and waved until I turned out of the neighborhood. I drove 4 of the 6 hours on autopilot. Somewhere around Chattanooga, I pulled off at a rest stop and sat with the engine running for a long time. I was not angry yet. Anger came later. What I felt in that rest stop parking lot was something quieter and colder. It was the particular grief of understanding something you had been refusing to understand for a long time. Claire had not said anything monstrous at that dinner table. She had said what she actually thought, in a voice she probably believed was private, and what she thought was that I was a future logistical problem. That, when the time comes, and that phrase, when the time comes, kept circling through my mind like a dog that won't settle her life, would not be the place where I belonged. What cut deeper was the word we. We've actually been talking. We can't. We have our lives here. My son had been part of that conversation. My son had agreed with it. And my son had stood in that kitchen and said, Claire, in that specific quiet way, not because what she was saying was wrong, but because she was saying it where I might hear. I drove the rest of the way home in the dark. I spent December being useless. I went through the motions of my days, the coffee in the morning, the walk around the neighborhood, the evenings with the television on, and the volume lower than it needed to be. Patricia called and I told her Thanksgiving was fine. I did not tell her what I had heard. I was not ready for her response, whatever it would be. What I was doing in that quiet December was thinking, I am 68 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer for the state of Tennessee. I designed load-bearing structures for a living. I understand, better than most people, that the weight a thing can carry is determined not by what you hope it can hold, but by what it is actually built from. I had spent years loading weight onto a relationship and telling myself the structure was sound. That December I was doing the math I had been avoiding. The house I live in is paid for. I own it free and clear. It is a 4-bedroom house on 3 acres outside of Knoxville, with a detached workshop and a pond that I have stocked with base for 20 years. Ruth loved that pond. I used to carry her lawn chair down to the bank on summer evenings, and she would sit and read while I fished, and we would talk when we felt like it, and be quiet when we didn't, and it was, I know now, one of the best things my life ever contained. I also have retirement savings, a pension from the state, Social Security, an investment account that Ruth and I had been careful with for 40 years. I am not a wealthy man, but I am, as these things go, secure. In my will, as it stood that December, the house and the bulk of the estate went to Ethan. A meaningful sum went to Patricia. A trust was set up for Noah's education. I had written that will 6 years ago with a lawyer downtown, and I had not looked at it since the day I signed it. I looked at it in December. Then I made an appointment. My lawyer's name is Howard Gaines. He has been my lawyer for 22 years. He is 71 years old and reminds me of the kind of man who has heard enough of human nature to be unsurprised by most of it. I sat across from him in his office on the 2nd floor of a building on Gay Street, and I told him what I had heard at Thanksgiving. Not dramatically, just the facts of it, the way I would present load calculations. Howard listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I have always valued about him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Walter, you have every right to do what you're considering. Let me tell you what your options look like." We talked for 90 minutes. I left with a legal pad of notes and a follow-up appointment for the following week. What I decided was not an act of cruelty. I want to be clear about that, though I understand some people will see it differently. I decided that the structure I had built was being treated as a given, as something that would simply be there when needed, requiring nothing in return, generating no obligation. I decided that was not a structure, that was a dependency, and I had spent my career building things that were honest about what they were. I rewrote the will. The house and the land went into a charitable remainder trust with a conservation organization I had worked with during my career. After my death, the property would be preserved. The investment account was restructured. A generous portion went to Patricia outright. A college trust for Noah was maintained. I am not punishing a 4-year-old for decisions made by adults, but it was restructured so that it passed through Patricia as trustee, rather than through Ethan and Claire. The remainder went to 2 organizations Ruth had supported, a hospice in Knoxville and a literacy program for adults. Ethan received, in the revised will, the contents of my workshop and my fishing equipment. I included a letter of explanation, sealed, to be opened at the reading. I called Howard the following week and signed everything. I felt, driving home from that second appointment, something I had not expected to feel. Not satisfaction, exactly. Not relief. It was more like the feeling of setting down something heavy that you have been carrying for so long, you forgot you were carrying it. I did not call Ethan. I did not send a letter. I went back to my life. February brought a cold snap that kept me inside for most of 2 weeks. I reorganized Ruth's recipe box. I found a card she had tucked in the back, not a birthday card or a holiday card, just a note card in her handwriting that said, in her looping cursive, "Don't hold on so tight that you forget to open your hands." I put it on the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a base that Noah had given me 2 Christmases ago. March came, and with it, something I had not planned for. Ethan called on a Sunday. Not a text, a call. I answered. He started with small talk and I let him have it. The weather, work. Noah had learned to ride a bike with training wheels. I made the right sounds. Then the small talk ran out and there was a silence that had weight to it. He said, "Dad, I've been thinking about Thanksgiving." I said, "Have you?" It was not a question. He said he knew something had been off when I left early. He said Claire had told him, a few weeks after, that she realized she had said something I might have overheard. I noticed he said Claire had told him, not that he had figured it out himself. That landed somewhere in my chest and I noted it and set it aside. He said, "I should have called sooner." I said, "Yes." Another silence. He said, "What she said, what we had talked about, I want you to know that wasn't the whole picture." It wasn't. He stopped, started again. I got caught up in her way of thinking about things. I do that sometimes. I know I do that. I looked out the window at the oak tree. The first green was starting at the tips of the branches. It had been a long winter. I said, Ethan, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer it straight. Not the answer you think I want. The straight one. He said, okay. I said, do you think about me as a person? Not as your father, not as a resource, not as a future problem to be managed. As a person who is here right now, living a life, with things that matter to him. The silence this time was long enough that I thought the call might have dropped. Then he said quietly, no, I don't think I have been. I closed my eyes. He said, I'm sorry, Dad. The thing about an apology is that it does not undo the thing that made it necessary. I know that. Howard Gaines knows that. Ruth would have known that. But there is a difference between an apology that is offered to make the giver feel better and one that is offered because the person saying it has looked at themselves honestly and did not like what they saw. I have been alive 68 years. I know the difference. This sounded like the second kind. I told Ethan I had made some changes. I did not tell him what the changes were. I told him that if he wanted to understand them, he would have to come to Knoxville and sit across from me in the same room, not on a phone call, and have a longer conversation than we had had in years. I told him that I was not going to chase him, and I was not going to beg, and I was not going to pretend that things were fine when they were not. But I was also not going to close a door that he was choosing to walk back through. He said he would come. He drove up the second weekend in April alone. Claire stayed in Atlanta with Noah. I did not ask about that, and Ethan did not explain it, and we let that space exist between us without trying to fill it. He arrived Saturday morning, and we sat at the kitchen table and I poured coffee. And we talked for 4 hours. I told him what I had heard at Thanksgiving. I told him what I had felt in the rest stop parking lot outside Chattanooga. I told him about December, and about Howard's office, and about the legal pad of notes, and about what I had decided. I told him all of it the way I would tell the story to anyone who deserved to hear the full thing. He sat very still while I talked. He did not defend Claire. He did not deflect. When I finished, he put both hands around his coffee mug and stared at the table for a long time. He said, I have been letting her define things. What success looks like. What family looks like. What our obligations are. I've been letting her do that because it was easier than arguing. And I think somewhere in there I lost track of what I actually think. What I actually believe. I said, what do you actually believe? He looked up at me. He said, I believe you are my father. I believe you worked your whole life, and you were there every time we needed you, and you never once made me feel like a burden for it. I believe Mom would be ashamed of how I've handled the last few years. And I believe I have a son who calls you Pop, and who should know his grandfather. I got up and got the bourbon from the cabinet, because the coffee was no longer sufficient for the conversation we were having. I poured 2 glasses and set one in front of him and sat back down. I said, I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it as information and not as a threat. I made changes to my will in January. Significant changes. I did it because I needed to make a decision from an honest place, instead of from hope. I'm not telling you what the changes are because that is not the point of this conversation. The point is that I am not a placeholder in your life. I am not a contingency plan. I am not a problem to be solved later. I am your father, and I am here right now, and that is the only version of me you are ever going to get. He nodded slowly. He said, what do you need from me? I thought about Ruth and her note card on the refrigerator. I thought about Noah in his pajamas on the porch waving until my truck turned the corner. I thought about load-bearing structures and what they require to function and what happens when the weight is distributed wrong for long enough. I said, I need you to show up. Not perfectly, not on a schedule, just actually show up. Call me when something happens, good or bad. Bring Noah down here so he can learn what a bass looks like and help me in the workshop and know that his grandfather has a pond with his grandmother's lawn chair still on the bank. I need you to stop letting someone else define what your obligations are and start deciding for yourself. That's all I need. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I can do that. We fished that afternoon. I gave him the rod that had been my father's, which I had not given to anyone before. We stood at the bank of the pond in the April sun and we did not talk much, and that was all right. The quiet between us was different than it had been. It had space in it now instead of distance. He drove back to Atlanta on Sunday and called me Monday evening to say he had gotten home safely. He called again Thursday for no particular reason. He said Noah had asked about Pop and could they come visit in June. I said yes. I have not told Ethan everything that is in the revised will. That is not a secret I am keeping to punish him. It is more that the will was never really the point. The will was what an honest reckoning looks like when it is put into legal language. What matters is not the document. What matters is whether a person can look at himself clearly enough to change direction before it is too late. I walk by the oak tree every morning. It is taller than I am now by a factor I no longer track. I planted it 64 years ago, and it has outlasted more than I imagined it would when I put it in the ground as a 4-year-old sapling. There is something about watching a thing you planted grow into something that no longer needs you, that is either very sad or very satisfying, depending on what mood you are in when you look at it. Most mornings now, I find it satisfying. Noah came in June with Ethan, and they stayed 5 days. I taught Noah to hold a fishing rod. He caught a small bass on the second day and screamed with a volume that sent the ducks on the far end of the pond airborne, and then he held that fish up in both hands like a trophy and looked at me with the widest eyes I have ever seen and said, "Pop, I got him. I got him. Did you see?" Esau, I am 68 years old, and I have been a father and a husband and an engineer and a widower, and for a while, without meaning to, I had been letting myself become a footnote. That is done now. I am the man with the oak tree, and the pond, and the workshop, and the recipes in Ruth's handwriting, and a grandson who knows where the fish are. That is enough. That is, in fact, more than enough. And the bank of this old man has not closed. It has simply learned to require something in return, not money, not obligation, not a debt you are keeping track of. Just presence. Just the basic, simple, irreplaceable fact of showing up.